Hey everybody, welcome back. Thanks for taking the time to watch Hello Good Game. We're continuing on with our Magic the Gathering Arena Guide for Beginners. I believe this is part 4. We are looking at mid-range decks, how to build your dream mid-range deck. We took a look at all of the deck archetypes, then we broke down aggro and control. Mid-range kind of falls at the center. It plays both sides of the fence, if you will. It has both aggro elements in it and control elements, which make it incredibly versatile within especially the best of one meta. And when you go sideboarding, it gets even stronger. So before we talk about how to build your dream mid-range deck, we do need to clarify what exactly a mid-range deck is. So what exactly is a mid-range deck? To me, a mid-range deck is a deck that plays big, huge creatures. These threats are what the archetype is trying to maximize. You can't play a mid-range deck without excellent fatties. Now these are 4 to 6 drop creatures that should be able to finish your opponent in 2 to 3 turns at most. High curves. Mid-range decks sport relatively high mana curves. They contain spells for the early game that lead into cards included for the mid to late game. They're also relatively good incentive to play scaling cards with X included in the mana cost that get better and better as the game progresses. Alongside a high mana curve comes lots of mana. Because of their high curves, mid-range decks must reserve a healthy amount of deck slots to mana to efficiently play their spells. You'll often find mana acceleration and mana sinks that somehow make effective use of all the spare mana mid-range decks have to offer. Lastly, defense. Mid-range decks normally find one way or another to defend themselves, especially against aggro decks. Here you'll often find dedicated board control elements not unlike what we would expect or find within control decks. So we talked a little bit about some of the attributes within a mid-range deck, but how does that mid-range deck really operate? Well, Magic exists on a spectrum with fast, aggressive decks on one end and the slower, more controlling decks on the other. You could also define this spectrum on how much a deck wants to interact with its opponent. Simply put, mid-range decks fall into the middle of that spectrum. Aggro decks usually include minimal interaction and focus directly on dealing damage to the opponent, whereas control decks interact heavily. A mid-range deck has properties of aggro and control, capable of playing the role of the aggressor and the controller depending on the situation. A typical mid-range deck has an early game plan of mana ramp and control, but begins to play threats once it has reached 4 to 6 mana. A mid-range deck will often seek to play a reactive, attrition-based game plan against aggro decks, and a more proactive, tempo-style game plan against control decks. Colloquially is referred to as going bigger than aggro and getting under control. Mid-range decks are aggressive decks that flip the standard aggro control deck archetype by attempting to control the early game, then going aggressive with large creatures in the mid to late game. Midrange typically features very few creatures in the 1 to 2 converted mana slot cost, instead tries to win with lots of creatures in the 6 to 3 mana range while casting aggressive removal, board sweeps, discard, and ramp cards early on in the game. A typical midrange deck usually plays Jund colors, as these 3 colors provide the most options for aggressive creatures and very nice removal. There are, however, different styles of mid-range decks, so now let's kind of break down some other potential mid-range archetypes or color combinations that we might want to be looking for. Some of our other example mid-range decks are Jund midrange, which we talked about, a powerful and flexible deck with virtually zero bad matchups, thanks to the access of the most powerful cards that each color can offer. Black gives great removal and powerful discard cards like Agonizing Remorse and Duress. Red is a reliable removal source within Bone Crusher Giant, and green has some of the best creatures like Questing Beast and Scavenging Ooze. Abzan midrange is very similar to Jund midrange, however, it trades the speed for powerful white-based cards like Elspeth Conquers Death, Shatter the Sky, and even Baneslayer Angel. Jeskai midrange, which has much more control elements, using board wipes like Shatter the Sky and Time Wipe, while utilizing draw engines like Narset Parter of Veils, and playing game-ending creatures like Dreamtrawler to consistently close out the game once we've established control. Temur midrange efficiently uses ramp creatures such as Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, Paradise Druid, or Risen Reef to smooth out their land, allowing us to play fat creatures like Terror of the Peaks or Cavalier of Thorns, which also will allow us to fill our graveyard, allowing Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath to be playable as early as turn 6 with its escape cost. So a deck that we've not really seen make a rise within Magic the Gathering Arena, but I believe will as time progresses, is Tron. That's why I've decided to include it within what a mid-range deck is, because it is defined by mid-range. Tron, which tries to build a triplet of lands known as Urzatron, Urza's Tower, Urza's Mine, and Urza's Power Plant as quickly as possible, and then uses the massive amounts of mana to play powerful cards like Karn, Liberated, and Wormcoil Engine as early as turn 3. So these are some huge creatures that we're able to get out because we're able to flood the mana very, very quickly. And now if our opponent doesn't have immediate removal, we're just going to ramp out from there and be able to play whatever we want. So typically, Tron is a modern style deck as far as I'm concerned. But I believe as Arena progresses, we're going to see more additions like we just seen Jumpstart, like we just seen Amocat Remastered being injected into the Arena format. So I don't think it will be too long until we see full out Tron decks as well. So what makes mid-range decks so good? I personally think it's a blend of a few things. The first is adaptability and versatility. The ability to play either aggressively or defensively is a huge advantage within blind matchups. Normally, this adjustment happens via the sideboard between matches. However, mid-range decks often come with both aggressive and defensive cards within their main deck. In an aggro matchup, push control or defense. If the match is against a control variant, use your more aggressive cards. This doesn't mean you won't need to sideboard though. Once determining the opposing threats, we can easily dump whichever strategy doesn't serve us and double down on the one that does. Mana and tempo. As with any deck, mana curve is the utmost importance for a mid-range deck. Tempo is gained from either outpacing your opponents with ramp and card draw, or from removing their threats at a reduced cost. Most mid-range decks either ramp with resource accumulation or have bulk removal. Card advantage. Card advantage is extremely important to mid-range decks. However, where control decks play cards like Divination and Jace's Ingenuity, mid-range decks are focused to be more creative. If your goal is to shine in the mid-game, it's a bad idea to spend a crucial turn drawing cards instead of developing or managing the battlefield. Instead, mid-range decks need to look for incidental card advantage that comes indirectly or is attached to another effect. Radha, Heart of the Kell is a perfect example. On turn 3, you really just want to be adding a creature to the battlefield, but Radha continues to pull her weight as long as she remains in play. Playing lands off the top of your library means getting more cards into play without spending anything from your hand. It also means increased chance of drawing non-land cards to mitigate the risk of a mana flood. The last thing that makes mid-range so good is its ability to quickly close out the game. The most important difference between a mid-range deck and a control deck is that the mid-range deck does not necessarily have inevitability. It's not guaranteed to win the game just by surviving long enough. Some mid-range decks have a sizable risk of mana flooding, while others might have trouble answering particular cards or combination of cards. Once you're ready, turn your creatures and your planeswalkers on your opponent, and you can use your removal spells to kill their blockers, and your opponent should be dead before they know what has happened to him or her. Next, we're visiting the different mid-range archetypes. Now, there are a few different subgenres within midrange. The first is Acceleration, or mid-range combo. This deck looks to focus on mana ramping early and then using a combination of cards to either win the game immediately or put our opponent in such a position where they will not recover. Attrition, which is mid-range control. We talked about this quite a bit. We're using plenty of removal early game and then using our late game threats to close out the game. Finally, we have Curving, known as mid-range aggro. This deck looks to play a creature every single turn and to not miss a creature drop. X drops are great in curving decks as they can fill multiple spots within our mana curve. Just like the other parts of the series, we're going to begin to construct our own mid-range deck, and you get the privilege of doing this alongside myself, a full-time content creator with over 500 Magic the Gathering decks under my belt. But before we do, let's begin to take a second look at some potential archetypes within midrange. First up, Gruul midrange. Gruul has a ton of creature removal and creatures of its own. So we have big green creatures plus red removal normally equals a good time. However, in this particular deck, we have things like Domri's Ambush. This is multicolored removal. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Then that creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. This is absolutely amazing removal within Gruul colors. We also have Bone Crusher Giant. Stomp deals 2 damage to any target, can't be prevented at instant speed. There's nothing like picking up a Priest of the Forgotten Gods as soon as she hits the field with your Bone Crusher Giant. It's not only removal that Gruul has though, we also have those big bad creatures like Questing Beast and potentially even Terror of the Peaks if that's the build route you plan to take. So we can ramp early on, use balanced removal to deal with our opposing threats like Priest of the Forgotten Gods, and then play our bigger creatures just a little bit earlier than our opponent will be, as long as they're not ramping. So Gruul midrange is one of the most reliable midrange decks because it focuses solely on 2 colors. However, it can potentially fall behind as it heavily relies upon its creature base. Gruul was extremely strong, but its removal was reliant on having creatures on the field. We can get around this through the addition of black, creating now a Jund midrange deck. We gain access to not only Hand Hate through discard and exile via Agonizing Remorse, but we also have a flash Death Touch blocker with life gain equaling survivability in our Blacklands Paragon potentially. Not to mention our instant speed, destroy target creature or planeswalker with converted mana cost 3 or less for 2, eliminate. We hold on to Bone Crusher Giant. That key piece of removal hasn't gone anywhere. And we also get to add Eat to Extinction, Extinction Event for nice forms of exile. Not to mention Casualties of War now being added to the pool through black as well. And new additions through Golgari, Varaska, and Liliana of the Dreadhorde. So there is a lot of heavy removal within Jund. It's not so toned back like in Gruul, but it just is maybe a little bit harder to hit those land consistencies, and it's going to require you having a couple rare lands, that's for sure. Now, Temur midrange has amazing ramp effects through Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, Risen Reef, Growth Spiral, Paradise Druid, Cultivate. So you see just how many options for ramping are available within Temur. Now here we're looking at a Temur control deck that focuses on flooding the field with resources and then putting huge oppressive planeswalkers in play like Ugin the Ineffable and Ugin the Spirit Dragon to completely shut down our opponent's game plan. There are other ramp creatures we can use more of a mid-range, like Cavalier of Thorns. This is also great because it will help us engineer our library in such a way that we're pulling the card that we want in case accidentally milled throughout the ramp process. Ugin is absolutely broken. As the meta progresses and evolves away from Ugin, the archetype will remain the same in the fact that we are using Temur ramp, which isn't going anywhere. It will always be strong. Just flooding the field with resources and then putting the biggest, most powerful, oppressive permanents in play, whether they be enchantments, artifacts, planeswalkers, or even potentially creatures, right? So Temur ramp is no joke for the control archetype. We also get lucky with Temur because we can play Temur as a mid-range combo archetype as well. We'll take a look at that in a second, but let's just enjoy the pure oppressive power of Ugin the Spirit Dragon, shutting down almost any deck once you get him on the field. You play him, -X, that's good game. Temur midrange combo is another great example of how midrange is still viable without all of the aspects of control laced within it, which we're used to seeing. You don't need to remove your opponent's creatures to get your attackers through if you have a million creatures. In this example of Temur midrange combo, we're using Genesis Ultimatum with all of our ramped mana, which hasn't changed. It's still Uro, it's still Growth Spiral, it's still Cultivate. Everything that you've known and loved with Temur ramp is still there. However, there's no Ugin for the control effect. We go into Genesis Ultimatum, which will play Terror of the Peaks for us along with a plethora of other creatures. And this will do huge damage to any target that we wish, whether it be our opponent's health points, removing their creatures, hitting their planeswalkers. It gets better than that though. We also have Yorion the Sky Nomad to flash all of our creatures back into play to increase the value that we get from our Temur ramp that much more. re-triggering all of our elementals on our Risen Reef, re-triggering all of our creatures in general on top of our Terror of the Peaks is an easy way to close out matches without the control aspect in a mid-range deck. Now that you have a deeper understanding of exactly what a mid-range deck is, its capabilities and weaknesses, we're going to begin our deck building process. I built over 500 decks within Magic the Gathering Arena, so I am no stranger to the process. I hope you're able to take home some of these principles, guidelines, customs, and strategies that I use within my own process in your future builds. Because it's not about building one deck, it's about building all of the decks to come. And if we can incorporate all of the things we've learned today, we're really going to increase the value, consistency, strength, and power of our mid-range decks. So let's open our client and begin talking about some of the customs, principles, strategies, and synergies within the mid-range archetype. All right, now that we've got our game client open, we're going to begin constructing our mid-range deck. The first objective is to choose a sub-archetype within mid-range to focus on and engineer around. I really like the acceleration within mid-range. However, the attrition is a nice addition as well, so we're going to try to blend those two. Previously, I was thinking of going Temur and just doing straight acceleration. However, we've seen a few clips of that already, so I want to build an organic original deck that you've not seen yet. So I love the ramp available within Simic, so let's start by building our ramp within the deck. Add mana, right? That's what I like to search. So we're ramping. We love Nissa. She is an absolute powerhouse. It's a little late game, her ramp, but it'll still get us there. Paradise Druid is another mana dork that can tap to give us mana at any time, which is great. Of course, Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, is an absolute beast in the ramp game. Cultivate as well allows us to play an additional land each turn. Speaking of an additional land each turn, Growth Spiral is the best card, especially the best common card, allowing you to play an additional land and giving you a draw for 2. What? So you can see we're beginning to fill out a little bit of ramp, and we're already at 44. We could go a little bit further with Gilded Goose. And now I believe we have a very good position to ramp. We could go with Cavalier of Thorns, but that's pretty mana intensive, especially if we're not flexing any elemental work there. So we do have black within Sultai. So now that we have our ramp, let's begin to weave in some removal. Eliminate is just absolutely oppressive. Instant speed for 2, it's so good. Extinction Event as well, I'm having a lot of fun with, just because of the exile effect. It's very powerful. Now, Sultai doesn't have access to white, so there's no Shatter the Sky. So we really need to make sure that we have all of the removal that we can get. Speaking of that, let's just do a general search for exile and see what we can get. Agonizing Remorse. This is a beautiful card. Exiling a target creature or permanent from our opponent's hand is really good. Eat to Extinction as well. Instant speed, exile, a very good card. And we're already over 60, so we've not even begun to execute our game plan or our kill scenario, which we should try to figure out what we want to do to win the game. Are we just removing our opponent's creatures and winning with Nissa? Well, probably, but what are we going to use Nissa's land on? Personally, I think Casualties of War is a very good mid-range card. It's expensive, so it's utilizing all of your mana through the ramp that we've worked so hard to do, and it oppresses our opponent to the maximum, destroying target artifact, creature, enchantment, land, and planeswalker as long as they have all of them. If not, we just get the ones that they do. So Casualties of War has huge value for 6 mana, normally something that you'd have a hard time playing. However, with such powerful ramp within the deck, I don't think we should have that much problem. So again, overfill your deck and then trim it back after, right? We've just started this process. I think we'll probably just stick within best of 1. What other things can we really use our Nissa on? We don't have a ton of draw within the deck, so I'm thinking a couple Hydroid Krasis. This is great for the acceleration because of the X cost. We can cast it for 4, for 2, for 6, for 10, for 20, as much as we want, and then we're getting those beneficial effects. It can be countered, but the effects will still trigger if it's countered, which is really quite nice there. So sitting at 68 cards, that is a little bit heavier than we'd want. So we're going to trim the goose. That brings it down a little bit. We still want 4 Casualties of War. We still want 4 Nissas. It's really important for us to be dropping these consistently on turn 4, turn 5, right? Because of the ramp. So how else can we really make sure that we're getting to our location as quickly as possible? We could even potentially work in things like Murderous Rider. Now I know we should be trimming from the deck, but we're adding. Not a bad mid-range card, I don't think. It can kill a planeswalker or creature. We lose 2 life, but it can come back later with life gain, which could potentially help us, right? It's a hard choice when trimming your deck as well, especially since mid-range decks really do rely on a lot of land. You don't want to trim too many. And we've worked ourselves into 67 cards, so let's begin to trim some down. We'll remove an Agonizing Remorse. We can remove and eliminate. I think we can probably take out a Cultivate as well. And then, wow, this is hard. 1 Casualties of War, only needing 3. I really like Hydroid Krasis, so it's hard to throw, but I feel the need to balance a little bit more consistently. We can lose the Druid, I guess, and then try to use more Cultivates, because the Druid does have some negative effects, say with our Extinction events. So if we just play a Cultivate and then really rely on our Extinction event and eat to Extinction later on, it should work. And then we have 3 Murderous Riders and 3 Eliminates to deal with things once they've hit the field, and then a Remorse early game to pick up maybe an Uro out of their hand or something. So this is my general mid-range deck. Of course, we want to now begin to balance our lands. So let's go over here to lands. Hit that multicolored, and Simic is incredibly important for us to ramp off the start. So 4 breeding pools. And now if you don't have the rare lands, I really recommend that you guys spend the wild cards or farm the rare lands. They are going to make the game so much more consistent. It's not even funny. So we might want a few scries as well. But again, we're just really making sure that we have that green and the blue. So the shock lands are totally fine with us, as long as they are one of our primary colors, green or blue. So we're sitting at 60. We still have 6 swamps, 3 forests. We could potentially run castles, but I don't necessarily think that's a great option. The best option is to run things that tap for a green source, like our Temple of Mystery here. Just because when Nissa hits the field, those green mana source now become doubled down. And we'll do a few Temple of Maladies as well. Not too many, probably just 2. Balancing your land does come down to a bit of an equation. You want to count all of your mana symbols and then minus your mana ramps. We took our Paradise Druid out, so that doesn't really count. But regardless, that's one of the pleasures of using Magic the Gathering Arena, is that it's going to auto balance your land yourself, and then you can kind of just adjust it from the values that it's given you base wise. Again, when we do build our decks after we've completed this, like we have here, we're going to begin to test the deck. We go into the play queue, we play a few rounds, we make sure the lands support our play lines, and then we adjust from there. Building a deck is never a one and done process. It comes down to refining, fine-tuning, and improving it as you continue to progress. The meta changes. It's your job and responsibility to adapt to it as quickly as possible. So I hope you guys enjoyed this general mid-range deck building guide. We decided to go with Sultai over Temur. lacing in some removal. So I think we should have no problem ramping way ahead of our opponent, removing their important creatures, and then oppressing them with things like Casualties of War and killing them with lands from Nissa. How do you feel about midrange? Are you a little bit more comfortable with the archetype? Are you excited to get building some decks? Is it going to be a curve deck, an attrition deck, or an acceleration deck? What colors are you going to use? Let me know down below in the comments, you guys. Thanks so much for watching. Tomorrow we're back with how to build a combo deck, Magic the Gathering Arena Guide for Beginners. I hope you're excited. I know I am. I'm live on YouTube every single day at 6 a.m. Mountain Standard. At 7, we go live on Twitch for as long as 8 hours. And then we're in the Discord for the entirety of the day. Links for everything is in the description below. Thank you so much for your continued time and attention. Your support is absolutely incredible. Everybody supporting the channel financially. Oh my lord, I do not even have words for you guys. Myself and the community, thank you wholeheartedly. You're making content of this caliber actually accessible for me to do. So we all appreciate you. Thank you so much. I hope you're excited for the next parts within this series, Magic the Gathering Arena Guide for Beginners. Take care, and we'll see you soon.